went to penitentiary. Gene Wilder, I did a movie. I went to, not me personally, I mean, I went to do a film in penitentiary.
20 years. Richard Pryor, the genius of comedy. The man who dared to tear apart every convention. He is gone, leaving behind a treasure trove of laughter and a mountain of secrets. The crowd thought they knew it all. Drugs, affairs, self-destruction. But the truth, it has never been spoken. His family stayed silent for 2 decades, and now they have finally decided to reveal it. Details no one has ever heard. Haunting scenes from his final days. Secrets strong enough to change everything we ever thought about Pryor. What did he laugh to conceal? How did he live behind the curtain? And in the end, was what we always suspected actually true? Before the audience knew Richard Pryor as the king of comedy, he was a child crushed beneath the weight of darkness. No spotlight, no laughter, only the noise of sinful streets, the bone-chilling cold, and the merciless silence of adults. It was there, in a brothel and on violent corners, that a soul was tested, a fire was suppressed. And later, it erupted into a comedy both raw and painfully real. But before he could step into the light, he had to walk through the hell of childhood. The harsh beginning of Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor's starting point was the chaotic sounds of a troubled neighborhood in Peoria, Illinois, where he was born on December 1, 1940. Instead of growing up in a nurturing embrace, young Richard had to find his own way to adapt in a harsh environment where the winter cold constant arguments and the absence of family love became everyday realities. His father was often absent while his mother left when he was only 10, leaving behind an unfillable void. Richard lived with his grandmother, a strict and tough woman, in a world full of instability. His childhood was tied to street tales, to early confrontations with the raw reality of life. From a very young age, Richard was forced to observe, to listen, and more importantly, to learn how to protect himself with witty remarks, laughing to survive, joking so as not to be belittled. But behind that laughter, there was always a hidden sadness. He once shared that his childhood was a string of days filled with loss. By the age of 7, he had already endured unspeakable shocks that left permanent scars on his young heart. Those experiences became the raw energy for his later performances, not polished, not hidden, but bare truths transformed into laughter. Because he had known what it felt like to be hurt, Richard understood how to make audiences laugh, while also confronting them with the truth behind it. In the early 1950s, America still bore deep racial prejudice. In a small industrial city like Peoria, a young black boy had to face every kind of scrutiny and barrier. Richard was not shielded. On the contrary, he had to fight against mockery. By the age of 12, he dropped out of school and wandered the streets. No diploma, no direction. Only one skill remained: telling stories that made people laugh. And for him, that skill wasn't for entertainment, it was for survival. If he couldn't make people laugh, he would be cast aside, pushed to the margins. In 1953, when he had just turned 13, his mother left completely. Richard remained with his grandmother, the only one still by his side. But that bond carried more discipline than warmth. The house where Richard lived was unlike any other home. It was a place where he witnessed unpredictable situations, conflicts, and clashes. From there, once again, he learned to observe, to remember to turn absurdity into stories he would later retell. A childhood in such a rough environment forged a different Richard Pryor. He did not indulge in illusions, nor did he sugarcoat the truth. Every line, every laugh carried the weight of lived experience. Later generations called him the Picasso of comedy, but few realized that the picture was painted with the dark shades of his childhood. For Richard, there was no clear line between tragedy and comedy. He brought everything he had endured, no matter how brutal, onto the stage, turning it into an art form that made audiences laugh, while leaving them in stunned silence. As a teenager, Richard was expelled from schools multiple times for his blunt personality. He was thrown into life with nothing but his storytelling gift. But that very gift became his lifeline. In dingy bars or cramped street corners, the 16 or 17-year-old boy began telling stories of everyday life. People gave him a few coins, a few beers in exchange for hearing a young man who dared to speak bluntly, who dared to mock even the taboos. No classroom, no teacher. Richard learned to become an artist in his own way. Richard's difference lay in the way he chose to face adversity. He could have collapsed, disappeared like so many others, but he chose to turn everything into raw material, into unfiltered truth. Each time he stepped on stage, Richard seemed to wield a scalpel dissecting his own memories. No concealment, no embellishment. And it was precisely this raw honesty that made audiences unable to look away. The sweat-soaked struggles of Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor was not born to be carried forward. He had to fight for every inch of ground, every glance from the harshest audiences in America's dingy bars of the 1960s. After a brutal childhood, the young man from Peoria decided to test his luck on stage. But that stage was anything but glamorous. It was just a few square feet, a dim yellow light clouds of cigarette smoke, sharp bursts of laughter mixed with curses. There, if your joke wasn't sharp enough, you'd be booed, or even have a glass hurled in your face. And Richard stood on such stages night after night. At first he was heavily influenced by Bill Cosby, the clean, safe comedian who fit neatly into family television. Richard mimicked that style, trying to appear proper, avoiding offense, avoiding shock. But the more he performed, the more suffocated he felt, because those stories weren't his. That wasn't Richard Pryor, the child who had grown up in darkness, who had witnessed so much adversity. So in 1967, during a show in Las Vegas, while standing before the audience, Richard suddenly stopped. He looked at the crowd, looked at himself in the mirror behind him, and quietly walked off, without a word of explanation. That moment was a turning point. It marked his decision to abandon the safe shell and search for his true voice. After that event, Richard disappeared for a time, traveling across America, observing, taking notes, gathering fragments of real life. When he returned to the stage, he was no longer a Cosby imitator. He was himself, raw, sharp, fierce. He talked about poverty. He talked about the police. He talked about drugs, about prejudice, about the pain everyone saw, but no one dared to say out loud. And the audience erupted. They didn't just laugh. They roared, they slammed their tables. They saw themselves reflected in him. But reaching that moment required Richard to endure countless grueling jobs. He swept floors, washed dishes, hauled loads. By day, he worked odd jobs. By night, he hustled shows, sometimes sleeping on a torn chair in the club. His pay was only a few dollars, just enough for some food and bus fare. There were nights he had to choose between buying dinner or buying a bus ticket home. Many times he chose dinner, leaving the trip home for tomorrow. Some nights, Richard wandered the streets with an empty stomach, but a head full of stories that could make the world laugh. It was in those conditions that he honed a special ear, the ability to pick out the smallest details of life and turn them into punchlines. A staggering drunk, an old woman cursing a grumpy cop. All of it Richard memorized, exaggerated, and replayed on stage. This wasn't imagined comedy. This was lived comedy, street comedy. By the late 1960s, Richard began to catch the eye of producers. He was invited to appear on shows like The Ed Sullivan Show and The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. These were golden opportunities, but also traps. Television at the time wanted a safe Richard, uncontroversial, not too real. Again, he found himself torn. On one side was his blunt, straight-to-the-gut laughter, on the other, the pressure to polish himself for national broadcast. And Richard chose risk. He broke scripts, spoke in his own voice. Sometimes he shocked, sometimes he left audiences stunned. But in doing so, he created something unmistakably his own. In the 1970s, that difference began to exact a price: addiction tension. Richard had shows canceled repeatedly for outbursts, but at the same time, his comedy albums exploded in the market. In 1974, That Nigger's Crazy won a Grammy. A year later, Is It Something I Said earned him another. It was a success no other black comedian of his time had achieved. The name Richard Pryor began to be spoken of as a phenomenon, a man daring to place the unspeakable right in the middle of America's living rooms. Alongside success came collapse. Richard endured nights of shows, until exhaustion mornings, waking up in cheap motels, without remembering where he had performed the night before. There were times he argued with promoters over a few more dollars just to afford a meal. Behind the spotlight lay days of grinding, of trial and error, of sweat and tears. Gradually, the bare truth he brought to the stage became his strength. Audiences didn't come to see Richard Pryor for made-up tales. They came to hear someone living, Real speaking, real laughing, real. He made people feel they weren't alone in their injustices, fears, disappointments. Laughter became a collective medicine, and Richard was the unlicensed yet powerful doctor. Looking back on those early years, it's clear Richard's path was paved with blood and sweat. From a dropout boy in Peoria, sleeping rough, performing for spare change, he climbed onto America's biggest stages facing thousands of spectators. No diploma, no backing, just a single weapon truth. And that truth, sharpened by him, became comedy that was both hilarious and unforgettable. Richard Pryor, of those struggle-filled years, proved that true art always comes from lived experience. No one can fake pain, fake poverty, fake discrimination, and still make people believe. Richard didn't have to fake anything. He just told his life story, and the whole world leaned in to listen, stepping into the bright lights. By the 1970s, Richard Pryor was no longer just a street comedian. He had become a national phenomenon. The dingy bars of his early days were now only memories. Before him were the bright lights of grand stages, thousands of fans scrambling for tickets, thunderous applause that seemed endless. But what stood out was this: Richard never changed at his core. He remained the man who dared to speak, dared to touch nerves, dared to stir up the harsh truths society preferred to ignore. His first deeply personal comedy album, That Nigger's Crazy, 1974, was an explosion. At a time when racial prejudice was still strong, a black artist putting that charged word in the title was an act of defiance. The result? The album not only sold well, but also won him his first Grammy. A year later, Is It Something I Said earned him another Grammy. The laughter Richard Pryor delivered was no longer just personal, it had become the collective voice of a generation. From stand-up, Richard moved into film. He co-wrote the script for Mel Brooks's Blazing Saddles 1974, a biting satire on race and power. Although he didn't land the lead role, Pryor's imprint on the dialogue was unmistakable. Bold, sharp striking at society's most sensitive nerves. He went on to star in a string of hits such as Silver Streak 1976 and Stir Crazy 1980, with Gene Wilder forming one of Hollywood's most beloved comedy duos. Stir Crazy alone grossed over $100 million at the box office, an enormous figure for its time. 4. But it was on the stand-up stage that Richard truly reigned. His series of HBO specials, Richard Pryor Live in Concert, 1979, Live on the Sunset Strip 1982, and Here and Now, 1983, set the standard for modern stand-up comedy. Pryor didn't just tell jokes. He created an entire universe of characters. Gruff cops, trembling addicts, even his own heart and lungs. He slipped into roles, shifted voices, transformed his body language, making audiences feel like they were watching a film unfold live on stage. What made Pryor different was his undiluted honesty. He didn't shy away from telling stories of his own downfalls, his struggles with addiction, his battles with illness. He turned himself into art. When talking about a near-fatal heart attack, he didn't hide his fear. Instead, he mocked himself. I heard my heart say, "Whatever else you plan to do, do it quick because I'm quitting now." The crowd roared with laughter, but they also shuddered. Pryor showed them the fragile line between life and death, tragedy and comedy. That very truth made Richard the idol of an entire generation of comedians. Eddie Murphy, Chris Rock, Dave Chappelle all admitted they learned how to stand on stage from him. Eddie Murphy once said flatly, "If there was no Richard Pryor, there would be no Eddie Murphy." Chris Rock called him the one who taught us that comedy isn't just for laughs, it's for survival. At the height of his career, Richard Pryor was given the chance to host Saturday Night Live and contribute to major screenwriting projects. He won a total of 5 Grammys for his comedy albums, 1 Emmy, and was honored by the Writers Guild of America. In 1998, Comedy Central ranked him #1 on its list of the 100 greatest stand-ups of all time. However, his overwhelming success was not always accompanied by glamour. After the roaring performances, Richard Pryor still had to face multiple sclerosis diagnosed in 1986, along with the heavy toll of a reckless lifestyle. Yet even as his body weakened, he brought that story to the stage, telling it with ruthless humor. He turned his illness into a joke, not to trivialize it, but to strip it of its power, allowing audiences to look truth in the eye and still laugh. When speaking of Richard Pryor, one cannot simply call him a comedian. He was a storyteller, a social mirror, a man who dared to make his thorn-filled life a reflection for all. He succeeded not just through talent, but through an irreplaceable style, a fierce blend of tragedy and comedy, of truth and satire, of darkness and light. Richard Pryor left behind a legacy not only in laughter, but in the way he transformed laughter into a weapon, a shield, a medicine. And 2 decades after his passing, no one has yet managed to fill that void. The battle with darkness. Behind the stage lights where Richard Pryor made millions laugh until they cried, lay a brutal battle he himself nearly lost many times. Success had lifted him to the peak, but it also hurled him into deep abysses that only truth could expose. Richard was never one to hide. He lived straight, spoke straight, and even his most dangerous habits were no exception. Addiction became the shadow haunting him throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Drugs not only ravaged his health, but also suffocated his spirit, pulling him away from family, dragging him to the edge of death. In 1980, Richard Pryor shocked the world when he set himself on fire in a drug-induced frenzy. His body engulfed in flames, he ran into the street in panic. Witnesses recalled him as a living torch blazing through the Los Angeles night. The incident set off a media storm, left friends in tears, and stunned millions of fans. Richard survived that collapse, but his body bore scars that would never fade. Yet, true to the essence of an artist who could turn pain into laughter, Pryor brought that very experience on stage. In Live on the Sunset Strip, 1982, he stood before the audience retelling the horrifying scene with biting sarcasm and self-mockery, leaving the crowd laughing and crying at the same time. A terrifying moment had become a classic routine, proving once again his strange power to transform personal hell into a feast of entertainment for the world. But the battle didn't end there. Richard's body grew weaker. He had to fight multiple sclerosis, a cruel disease that eroded muscles and stripped away control of the nervous system. In his early 40s, he was already living with relentless decline. Every step slowed. Every tremor in his hands grew more visible. Every worried glance from his loved ones weighed heavier. The illness tested not just his body, but the spirit of a man who had once ruled the heights of fame. And then came his heart. Richard suffered multiple heart attacks, forcing him to undergo surgery. In 1990, he nearly collapsed for good after a severe one, prompting doctors to warn him he could no longer live by burning his body out. But Pryor somehow still found the energy to climb on stage, turning his treacherous heart into a character, a grumpy old friend in his monologues. His way of fighting fate was not silence, but to tell it all, forcing everyone to hear, to see, and to laugh. The Pryor family witnessed those battles up close. His wives, his children. They loved him, yet felt powerless as they watched him suffer. Sometimes Richard's home was no sanctuary, but a battlefield of arguments, fear, and disappearances, when he vanished for days chasing drugs. And yet, family was the only anchor that kept him from sinking all the way down. Many times he admitted, "If it weren't for them, I probably would have been gone long ago." While audiences hailed him as the greatest comedian of all time, Richard was living as a quiet warrior, fighting invisible enemies inside his body. That paradox only made his story more tragic and epic. On stage, he was immortal. But when the lights went out, he returned to being a fragile man lost amid illness and loneliness. What set Richard apart was how he never hid his pain. He could tremble, he could weaken, but with a microphone in hand, he became a warrior, recounting his failures with relentless courage. That is why audiences loved him, because Richard never pretended to be perfect. He laid bare the wreckage so people could look at it and realize they too could laugh even with lives full of scars. Each time he collapsed, Richard Pryor stood up again, not because he was stronger than anyone else, but because he refused to let darkness steal laughter. He understood that audiences needed real stories, someone willing to turn ugly truth into art. And that made him a legend, not a flawless legend, but one brimming with life. Richard Pryor proved one thing. Sometimes comedy is not just laughter. It is a scream against fate. It is the fire that keeps one standing through the storm. And for Pryor, comedy was the ultimate weapon in his battle against the darkness of his life. Family speaks out in buried truths. 20 years after Richard Pryor drew his last breath, his loved ones finally began to speak. And when they did, the world was stunned. For behind the legend, there was not only laughter, not only stage lights, but also shadows, pain, and secrets buried for decades. His wife, Jennifer Lee Pryor, was among the first to break the pact of silence. She had witnessed Richard struggling in a house filled with smoke, and needles had held him as he convulsed from illness, had sat beside him during brushes with death in hospitals. But what she revealed truly shocked the public. Richard Pryor was not only a victim of multiple sclerosis or of addiction, but also of a childhood scarred by violence and abuse. During those early years spent in a brothel run by his grandmother, Richard had witnessed and even endured things no child should ever face. Those psychological wounds never healed. His daughter Rain Pryor also once tearfully shared, "My father didn't just bring laughter to the world he carried within him, a sorrow no one could ever understand." Rain spoke of nights when Richard couldn't sleep, pacing the room like a cornered animal. He laughed on stage, but at home he wept. He embraced his daughter, yet his eyes were empty. These were the two parallel worlds of one man, an unbreakable icon in public, and a shattered soul within. The family also admitted that the rumors of Richard's chaotic love life were not just rumors. Jennifer openly revealed he had controversial affairs, tangled relationships, and even at one point spoke candidly of a homosexual relationship with actor Marlon Brando. The public was shocked. Fellow entertainers reacted in waves. But the family insisted he never regretted living honestly. That truth only made Richard's image more complex. A fearless comedian on stage, a vulnerable man behind the curtain, and a human being who dared to live beyond all norms. Those contradictions could have destroyed him, but instead, they became the raw material for his sharp and vibrant comedy. The family's confessions also opened a new perspective on Richard's legacy. It was not only Grammy-winning albums, sold-out shows, or million-dollar films. It was also a spiritual legacy, a reminder that even icons can bleed, stumble, and err. And only by accepting those dark parts can we truly appreciate the light. In recent years, the Pryor family has transformed those buried truths into action. Jennifer Lee Pryor became the keeper of his legacy, speaking at events, raising funds, publishing memoirs, to remind audiences that Richard's laughter did not spring from nowhere, but from the personal hell he endured. Rain Pryor chose the theater stage to tell her father's story, portraying him not as a distant idol, but as a flesh and blood man full of love, yet full of cracks. These testimonies explain in part why Richard Pryor remains irreplaceably compelling. Because every story he told, every role he played carried real experience. The experience of a wounded child, of a man who once went up in flames in real life, of a patient who sat in a wheelchair and still laughed at fate. And thanks to these late confessions, the public finally understands Richard Pryor did not just make us laugh. He taught us how to live honestly, to face truth, no matter how brutal it may be. His laughter, therefore, was not merely entertainment. It was therapy. It was proof that even in the deepest darkness, a flame could still be lit. The buried truths have at last been revealed. And rather than tarnishing the legend, they made Richard Pryor's legacy greater. For he was no flawless saint. He was a man full of scars, who still stood on stage and shouted, "I'm still here, and I will make you laugh, no matter what tomorrow brings." 2 decades later, laughter still calls Pryor's name. When Richard Pryor passed away on December 10, 2005, at the age of 65, the world did not just lose a comedian. It lost a revolutionary of the stage, a man who turned laughter into a weapon, a medicine, a mirror of society. But death did not end his story. On the contrary, it opened another journey, the journey of honoring a legacy that stretched far beyond cramped stages or silver screens. Right after the news broke, thousands poured into the streets of Peoria, his birthplace, to remember him. They carried not only flowers, but also tiny paper microphones, symbols of the tool he had wielded all his life to change the world, his voice. Global media unanimously hailed him as the greatest comedian of the 20th century. The New York Times wrote, "He didn't just make us laugh, he made us look at ourselves." The tributes did not end with the funeral. His family and the artistic community began the work of keeping Pryor's fire alive. His daughter, Rain Pryor, created plays about her father's childhood and career. Jennifer Lee Pryor, his final wife, took on the responsibility of preserving manuscripts, archives, and unreleased recordings in preparation for a Richard Pryor museum in Peoria. Within the comedy world, his name became the benchmark. Comedy Central ranked Richard Pryor #1 on its list of the 100 greatest stand-ups of all time, above George Carlin, Lenny Bruce, and Eddie Murphy. People said every black comedian after him walked the path he had cleared. Eddie Murphy declared, "If there was no Richard Pryor, there would be no me." Dave Chappelle called him the one who showed me that comedy could be so real it hurt. Pryor's legacy did not lie only in laughter, but in the way he dared to turn the stage into a battlefield of truth. He spoke of racism when society preferred to hide it. He talked about drugs, violence, illness when others hesitated. And he dared to make his own failures and pain into art. That rawness became the foundation of modern stand-up, where audiences not only laugh, but also feel, think, and confront themselves. Hollywood did not forget him either. In 2019, Netflix announced a Pryor biopic produced by renowned director Kenya Barris. Even before that, stars from Mike Epps to Marlon Wayans had expressed their wish to portray Pryor as a way of honoring the icon. Though the project remains unfinished, the interest proved that Richard is not just a memory, he is a legend every artist wants to reach. Pryor's legacy also carried social weight. He did not just open doors for black comedians to step into the spotlight, he helped shift the mindset of an entire generation of American audiences. In the 1970s and 1980s, when racial tensions still ran deep, Pryor made white and black audiences sit in the same theater and laugh at the same truths. That laughter broke boundaries, creating rare moments of unity. It was not politics, it was humanity. In his hometown of Peoria, the city named streets and venues after him. Richard Pryor Place and Pryor Pavilion became pilgrimages for fans. Each year, memorial events drew thousands, turning the small city into a cultural landmark. But perhaps the most precious legacy Richard left behind was the lesson, laughter can heal. From his own collapses, from scars both physical and emotional, he taught that there is no need to hide pain. Say it out loud, expose it, turn it into a story. And when the audience laughs, not only are they freed, but so is the artist. 20 years have passed. Richard Pryor remains a name invoked in every conversation about stand-up. Each new generation seeks out his old recordings, sits before the screen, and realizes that his laughter has not aged. It is still sharp, still painful, still as real as the first day. And each time audiences feel they are hearing a confession, not just from an artist, but from a man who lived, burned, fell, and rose again. Richard Pryor's legacy does not lie in his perfection. On the contrary, it lies in his courage to be imperfect. And it is that very imperfection that made him immortal. If you too believe that Richard Pryor's legacy, the laughter born of blood, tears, and truth, deserves to be heard forever, then like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. Every click of yours not only supports us, but also helps ensure that the stories of legends like Pryor will never be buried in the dark.
All data, analysis, and commentary in this video are presented based on information available at the time of production. The content is subject to change over time and should not be considered a definitive forecast.
There is still so much more to explore. Stories of resilience, legacy, and truth. Feel free to dive into some of our top recommended videos now appearing on your screen.